We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of History at Monash University in Melbourne. I think I messed that up. Monash.
No, that was close enough.
Okay. And author of Red Meat Republic, A Hoof-to-Table History of How Beef Changed America. Joshua Specht, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, so just the era that we're talking about, you follow this basically starting from the 1800s through the early 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Just tell us why beef? Why beef as a way of or what that tells us, I guess, about the way that America was developed, particularly the sort of the political economy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, at first the why beef, when I started writing this book, was I was just curious about it. And then what I discovered as I looked more and more about how beef was produced, that it tied into all these big stories at the heart of what it means to be American, but also at the heart of the American economy. So we think about the stories of the American West. Cattle ranching is obviously everywhere. We think about the history of cowboys. They're essentially cattle workers, as I talk about them. But also, the model for big industrial agriculture is pioneered by meatpackers, often working with beef in Chicago. So what I see is a set of 4 firms headquartered in Chicago. You can think of Chicago as kind of the Silicon Valley of its day. And they remake both agriculture in the United States, but in a way industrial production. They pioneer things like the assembly line, or for them, a disassembly line.
Okay, so let's start with this notion of the. Are you there?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Let's start with the notion of the cattle ranch, and you know you write that basically beef becomes or meat becomes a tool for conquest in some ways, and also a justification for one. Explain that dynamic.
Yeah, I think you've gotten to the heart of it. So if you think about the kind of far west in the United States, if you think about places like the Texas Panhandle.
I'm sorry, Professor, we're having a little bit of a... I'm sorry, Professor, excuse me. We're having just a little bit of problems. If I could just ring you back. We just have a little bit of trouble on the connection.
Sure thing.
Bye-bye. Folks, bear with us. Bear with us on this. Not sure what's going on, but...
Hello?
Hi. All right. Hopefully that's better. So I had asked you, you had characterized beef as both a tool for conquest and a justification for conquest. And by conquest, of course, we're talking about the genocide and the displacement and of Native Americans at this time.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And what I mean by that is that for much of the American West, it was an area considered initially, in particular, way too dry to farm. And so at times in the mid-19th century, it was a place you might want to cross over to get to somewhere like California, but it wasn't quite sure what you could do with this land. And at some point, Americans started to look around and they saw the bison. They saw lots of bison thriving, and they wanted to hunt those. But then they started to look at their cattle, and they thought, we could graze these on a large scale and just replace these bison with our cattle. And all of a sudden, they had an economic reason to use the land. They had a way they could make money out of it. And to them, this was a kind of higher use for the land than, say, either hunting bison, as American Indians were doing, or the kind of highly mobile agriculture they saw. So they both wanted to make money out of cattle, and they viewed that as making it legitimate to seize the land from American Indians. And they would not have been able to do this without the rise of this kind of range cattle industry.
Who were the they in this instance? And to what extent did they have like other, I mean, can you go into a little bit of the sort of the perhaps the other sort of like economic reasons why they would want to settle? I mean, it just seems like on some level they're looking around for, a solution to a problem that isn't there. unless that problem is, how can we exploit more? How can I amass more cash?
Right. Well, I think the motivations of these people is kind of hard to figure out. I wrestled with this as I wrote the book. So I tell the story of a woman named Susan Newcomb, who's born in the Midwest, and as a teenage bride moves with her husband to the very remote part of Texas. And I read through her diaries and I try to understand, well, what are they doing here? What is their plan? And to an extent, there was an idea that moving to a place like that could give you a fresh start. You might not have had, you might have been a second or third born in the Midwest, not getting the family farm. You could kind of create your own land. But, so at first a lot of these people were engaged in things like hunting. So they're hunting the bison, and we see a lot of crossover between kind of small-scale cattle ranching and bison hunting. And we just see a lot of attempts to basically play out the logic that had happened in the East Coast of the United States, right? The whole logic of the United States was based on acquiring land for farming, and once your area gets settled up, you kind of move farther and farther west, and eventually it got to these dry areas where you had to embrace something like cattle ranching.
I see. And then, so following that sort of that change that took place there, tell us what the relevance of, how reservations sort of played into this dynamic.
Well, one thing that I thought was interesting is I thought there was a kind of straightforward story of basically a violent story of the United States military essentially seizing all this land from American Indians, kind of opening up a vast canvas that then settled by American citizens. What I actually see happening is a kind of on-the-ground, small-scale process of people moving into places, taking land, and kind of fighting back and forth. So early cattle ranchers are almost like paramilitaries in some places. Then, towards the end of this process, they create this reservation system where the majority of land is taken by the United States. Many different American Indians are forced onto these very small parcels of land. And so I thought maybe that's the end of that story. But what you actually see is that the means for many of these American Indians to support themselves off the bison, they're gone. So they're forced onto this land that they can't really farm. They have no way to support themselves. And so the United States government starts supplying them with beef handouts, rations. And many times the lucrative contracts for these handouts come from ranchers. So this reservation system becomes an early subsidy. The ranchers then see these American Indians who are relying on, what they call handouts or rations at the time, and they say, look, these people can't support themselves. What we've done here is justified. So they look around and see this reservation system. It both subsidizes them and justifies what they've done to them.
So there's sort of like a classic self-licking ice cream cone. We put them in a position where they cannot sustain themselves, and then say their inability to sustain themselves is exactly why we've had to put them in this position.
Exactly. And of course, you see that kind of dynamic all the time with dispossessed and marginal populations as a justification from the more powerful.
And how does that just happen? I mean, do people just sort of like develop that as they go? How planned is that notion?
That's a fascinating question and one I thought about a lot. To some extent, there was a big picture plan. I more see it, though, as often if you look at what's happening in these kind of remote forts and outposts, what you actually see is they mostly want to just avoid conflict, but all of their assumptions and ideology matches the assumptions and ideology of these early ranchers. So whenever there's a conflict with American Indians, they obviously side with the ranchers and farmers. And so it's a kind of piecemeal process, but it all aggregates and matches up in kind of their big picture assumptions about what is justified. And behind everything is the assumption that we're using this land productively, therefore we can claim it.
Right. I've heard that somewhere before, actually, in my discussions with modern day libertarians, looking back on why their property rights trumped the indigenous people's property rights. But then,
interesting.
So moving from that era, we move into this sort of era of which ends up being a sort of a false start on some level of corporate ranches. Explain that dynamic and where are we in terms of time at this point?
Okay, so in our story, we're kind of We're talking earlier in the 19th century, so we're talking 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. But the story really takes off after the American Civil War ends in 1865. And so some of this is happening in the 1860s into the 1870s. And by the late 1870s, 1880s, investors from the American East and as far away as places like Scotland say, we could try to turn this ranching thing into big business. So they move in with lots of money, and they see 100 herds of 1,000 cattle, and they say, we can make this into one herd of 100,000 cattle. And where you dealt with hundreds, we deal with thousands or tens of thousands. And so all of a sudden, this becomes the hottest new investment of the 1880s. Everybody's starting up these ranches. You see these kind of millionaire playboys from places like England moving out west, and this is kind of their like toy business. But you also see this running on very sound business principles. The problem is people are a little too exuberant, a story we see oftentimes in the history of American capitalism. And everybody basically is over-investing, making bad deals, and the whole thing kind of blows up. So the big corporate ranch doesn't really take off because there's this big boom in cattle, and there are some disastrous winters in the 1880s. And at the end of that story, just when this is all falling apart, this boom and bust cycle, there's these firms in Chicago that start to think about how they can slaughter cattle in Chicago and distribute the meat fresh all around the country. And when everybody's going out of business, they're buying all their cattle, and all of a sudden these small companies in Chicago turn into global behemoths in the late 1880s.
Okay, so let me just stop there and just so we should also say, like, this period of time is, I just remember this from as a kid watching Bonanza and the Ponderosa, right? This was basically the story of the Ponderosa on some level, right? They were cattle ranchers.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so where is, when all these people are coming in, presumably after the Civil War, and they're coming in, they're pouring all this money, like, where's the market for this? Like, who is eating this beef and how, right? At that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So basically, most of the cattle, or there's a lot of cattle in Texas. And there's cattle all across the U.S., but the kind of surplus of cattle in Texas is the key to this story. So before the American Civil War, there had been some ranching in Texas, and Texas was linked with New Orleans, east to west. The American Civil War basically ends that trade because the Union doesn't want that happening. And all of a sudden, there are these cattle just accumulating in Texas doing their thing, right? Grazing, reproducing. And during the American Civil War in the 1860s, all these cities in the North are getting huge, and they're developing a national market. Chicago's a big city now. New York is getting even bigger. Boston. And so there's all these hungry people in these cities in the North, and all these cattle in places like Texas and kind of remote areas in the West. So as of right now, there's no way to really link those two. But these big ranches realize, hey, if we can move cattle quickly from Texas or Wyoming to Chicago, we can get rich. And so that's that kind of story you're telling me. So this is where you get the kind of famous cattle drives of the Old West, moving hundreds of thousands of animals to places like, Kansas to get them into the rail lines into Chicago.
And then in Chicago, presumably they go into the slaughterhouse and then they get sent to the east. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So in the early part of this story, Chicago is just kind of the center of the rail network east. So the animals go alive to Chicago, and then they spread out alive to cities around the east coast of the U.S. But starting in the 1870s, these savvy business people in Chicago start trying to figure out how to make a refrigerated rail car, essentially a moving refrigerator. It's kind of a disaster at first. They crash a lot. They try to hang the meat, and it swings too much, and the cars topple over. But eventually they work it out. And all of a sudden, instead of shipping these live animals all around the country, which can be expensive, they can do everything in Chicago, centralize all the business, and very quickly and cheaply send it everywhere fresh. And that's how these businesses capitalize on everything that's happening out west to take over global meat from Chicago.
And so you end up having this dynamic where because the corporate ranches got too big, I guess, and then they end up basically dispersing, or they had too much, liability. One bad blizzard can destroy their business.
Yep.
The slaughterhouses become the essentially have like a monopsony, I guess, and they end up controlling the market and therefore dictate both ends of the supply chain, right? Where, what they're going to pay and how much they're going to extract as it goes east.
Yeah, I mean, you've got it exactly right. So the technical thing would be, say, they have an oligopoly, oligopsony. So they are there's 3 or 4 firms, they control selling to customers and buying. Now, the less technical Texas version of that is to say they have both ends of the string, as people in the period like to say. And what that means is, basically, they can capture all the profit. So they go around the United States on the customer end and bankrupt all the local people. And so they control the whole supply chain there. And because the big ranches have failed, the meat packers in Chicago kind of dictate what they want to the ranchers, because the ranchers are all small and relatively scattered. And so they become a behemoth. And this mobilizes all sorts of political conversations about whether these packers are too powerful. Should the government do something? Maybe should they break them up, which is a bit like debates about tech companies today. But this starts a whole conversation about the relationship between business and government.
And there's a couple of at that point. Well, it's interesting, I guess, is like the quote from Sinclair Lewis. He was trying to appeal to people's hearts and missed and hit their stomach. The idea being Upton Sinclair. Sorry, the idea being that he was concerned about the plight of workers in this, and ultimately what really stuck with people was the sort of the quality and the safety of the meat, right? So is that why we get around this time, we're now around the Federal Meat Inspection Act, right?
Yeah. So basically what happens is, there's a story we can tell about these Chicago slaughterhouses. It's a story of kind of business genius and innovation. In a lot of ways, they pioneer what looks like the assembly line. And Henry Ford in his memoirs said he got the idea for the automobile assembly line from Chicago, although they called it a disassembly line because they were taking one animal carcass and making it into all sorts of different things.
Right.
And that could be a story of innovation, right? They come up with this breaking it into tasks. But it's also a story of incredible labor exploitation. Because when you break things into individual tasks, very specialized ones, it doesn't just magically make people more productive. It enables you to work them harder, right? So you have people who set the pace, so you pay a little more to work extra hard. You can train people and overwork them because you can replace them easily. And so the slaughterhouse becomes this site of incredible exploitation. And Upton Sinclair becomes curious about this and studies it, and he's a kind of socialist revolutionary. So he writes The Jungle, the story of this immigrant family's toil in Chicago, as this precursor to a revolution. But along the way, he talks about contamination quite graphically, talking about it, a finger falling into a vat, talking about animal feces contamination. And because that's so visceral to people who are eating things, that really becomes the way the public starts to mobilize. And if you think about it, business doesn't want to be regulated in terms of labor standards, but they're happy to work on sanitation issues because they want to restore consumer trust in their product. And so they quite quickly realize that this kind of sanitation is a problem they can, solve to encourage people. And that's how we get that problem.
And we should say also that specialization of the workers completely diminishes worker power, right? Because you become literally a cog in a machine.
Yeah, and so what we see, I mean, in my part of the story, I argue all this action happens between about 1880 and 1900 or 1910. And there are attempts to unionize, but there's a legal regime and a kind of government that's not very sympathetic to organized labor. And so they can't effectively unionize in the key story I'm talking about. Now, in the 20th century, meat packing workers do unionize, but already their baseline assumptions about the kinds of jobs they have are so kind of eroded by that period I write about. And so, yeah, worker power is quite limited during this period.
And then once we get into that sort of like the state regulating both the sort of the health requirements and the hygiene and best business practices, I guess. Following that, there becomes sort of like more questions about antitrust.
Yeah. So I like to think of a key actor at the end of my story is Teddy Roosevelt. So if we talk about Upton Sinclair as a revolutionary, Teddy Roosevelt is kind of the perfect politician to tame capitalism, which is kind of what happens. So he's very suspicious of big corporations, but he's also suspicious of organized labor and, what he sees as socialism. And so he says, in order to kind of save American capitalism from itself, we need to regulate it. So he accepts huge centralized meatpacking as kind of an inevitable development. But he says, we're going to, act to regulate them and prevent them from engaging in practices that are too predatory or from cooperating too much. And so he does things like he organizes an investigation of the meatpacking industry, or as they called it, the Beef Trust. When the meatpackers try to say, we're not colluding, we're all going to form one gigantic company, they say, no, you can't do that, and there's all sorts of court investigations starting to limit their power. But in all of this, they accept that big centralized food production is necessary to the world we live in, and that continues to today.
So, what is the... how much of this is sort of unique to meat as opposed to just sort of the development that we see? Where is meat relative to other, I guess, products or commercial, things like where, because obviously, we have this story that scholars have been looking at in terms of cotton and it being, closely tied into slavery, but the implications of the cotton in terms of the economy of the entire country, not just the South, but of the East, the Northeast, and around the world to a certain extent. The cotton, because of that dynamic of slavery and the free labor, and it begins to drive everything. Like where does meat, like, I guess, rate relative to cotton within that sort of ecosystem?
That's interesting. I like to think of it maybe as the questions of the early American economy and its exploitation and how it works and markets. Cotton is kind of the product to understand that. I think in the late 19th century, beef ends up being the perfect product to understand the challenges of the late 19th century American economy. And that's in part because it's so complicated to produce and distribute. So the fact that they want to distribute it fresh, people like fresh beef as opposed to some other meat products they might eat cured, because it has to stay fresh from Chicago to New York or Chicago to Boston or Chicago all the way to London, there's all sorts of challenges businesses face in coordination. Similarly, because cattle have to be produced far away, they're rural animals, there's all sorts of questions of coordination to get the animal from, say, Texas or Montana to Chicago. And all these challenges mean that the meat packers are figuring out these complicated questions of supply chains and distribution that create a model that then are copied in all sorts of industries, right? So they figure out how to efficiently slaughter an animal without it spoiling and pioneer the assembly line. They figure out how to distribute fresh products, which then becomes important to distributing fresh fruits and vegetables, which oddly the meat packers actually control in the early 20th century. And so all these challenges, the beef packers kind of pioneer the solution that then gets taken up by other people. And that's why I think understanding the history of American beef is so important.
What was driving the demand for meat? I understand, like, it's just, I guess my sense of that era was like, oh, meat is a luxury. You don't see it that much. Obviously because of the challenges you're talking about. But I'm trying to get a grip on, I would imagine that someone in that era, particularly in the mid 1800s, sees like, look at this massive country. And if I could put railroad tracks down everywhere in this country, I could own like everything. I could go in and speculate on real estate because I have control over transportation. I could speculate in real estate all across the country. I could look at destinations. I could look at places that we're going to have to pass through. But I need something to send by rail, and I need a commodity. And in terms of like going east-west, and I'm asking if this is if there's an element of this, like beef seems to be the thing, but there isn't a market for beef. How do we juice this thing? Like, I mean, how much of a market was there? Was this something that, like, we're going to, figure out how to downscale beef? I mean, because we have a version of this, right, in the early 70s when the Nixon administration basically said we're going to subsidize corn, which is going to make everything cheaper in terms of food.
Right.
And that's going to put more money in people's pockets, and it's going to help the economy, et cetera, which is going to help all these industries. I mean, of course, in the mid 1800s, there wasn't so many different sort of layers into making that determination. But how much of it was like, we're going to use beef as the thing that's going to sort of open up? We're going to create a market with that, but it's going to open up all these other markets for me.
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think from the viewpoint of the railroads, the funny thing about the story is, in terms of this fresh beef slaughtered in Chicago, the railroads are initially very skeptical. They don't want to get involved because they have such a good trade shipping live cattle all over the U.S. And so they force the meatpackers to develop their own ideas, their own refrigerated rail cars. And all of a sudden, when that takes off, the meatpackers are holding all the carts. So in a way, they become more powerful than the railroads. But to get to your point about why meat, I've thought about this a bit, because I kind of wondered, well, say they start producing all this beef, presumably they got to convince people to eat all this meat or to want it, right? And what I realized when I started reading about what beef kind of meant to people is that for most of the people who were immigrating and coming to the U.S., or already living in the U.S. in this period, they already had a pre-existing preference for fresh beef. Fresh beef, in a way, was a special occasion food. And so people were used to eating it on feast days or special kinds of holidays for special occasions. And so what that meant is, if you could provide them with this thing that had been expensive, so they only had it on special occasions, if you could provide them that cheaply, they would want to turn that special occasion food into an all-the-time food. And so the story and consumption becomes this occasional food becoming a dietary staple, and higher expectations in terms of quality. And so that just ensures that as much as you can produce this, in the late 19th century, people are going to consume it. Now, as we saw, beef consumption peaks in the 1970s in the U.S. and has come down some. But through that period, just anything you can produce, people will want it, and that kind of makes the distribution of beef, which is bulky and heavy, a perfect thing to distribute in a national rail network.
And so where does that leave us now? I mean, when we're looking at the story of sort of the, I guess, the political economy, where is beef's future, and what, I mean, I guess, what lessons can we learn in terms about the way that decisions were made going forward? I mean, the labor stuff seems to, and we're going to play an interview next week about the car industry, and so many decisions about logistics were made basically to diminish the power of labor.
Right.
It doesn't feel like that was as conscious of an effort in this instance, because the labor was so sort of, in some ways, except for in the slaughterhouses, removed in terms of the process of which stuff was being built. But, delivered. But, I mean, how much of that is, what is the lesson we're learning from this?
Well, I think there's kind of, I've thought about this some since finishing the book, and I think there's kind of two key things. I mean, the first is that labor is a major issue in terms of the slaughterhouse, and there's all sorts of fights in my period, and you still see it today. I mean, with these recent raids by ICE on these facilities in the South. So still kind of marginal labor is important to this business. But as far as lessons today, I think the key thing we see with industrial food, and it's pioneered in the beef industry, is that low prices to the consumer become an overarching organizing principle and a justification for things are done. So when people say, hey, this is exploitative of labor, or this is destroying local environments and communities, people from the industry say, well, that's what we have to do to provide cheap beef. And because the whole system is organized around that, then any change to that system is in fact going to raise food prices. And making food unaffordable is not exactly a good policy solution. So I think one of the insights is that changing these things is going to make it more expensive, and that ties into a much broader question about a more equitable society. So beef will become more expensive, and people need to be better able to afford it.
And
Beyond that, in terms of, go ahead.
No, I mean, is that used as a mechanism to prohibit reform? I mean, it sounds like
definitely. It is. Yeah. So in the 19th century, and then I'll tell you about the present briefly. The 19th century, you see that people are investigating Philip Danforth Armour, one of the biggest meat packers, and he basically says, we have to do this. If you want to feed the urban masses, feed the common laborers, he said at the time, these are the rules we have to play by, and that's how he avoids regulation. Today, if you think about increasingly in debates about the Green New Deal, where people are saying we have to think differently about beef production, basically often critics of that are saying, that they're coming for your hamburgers. They're saying you're not going to be able to afford your hamburgers anymore, and that turns a kind of consumer concern to deflect a criticism of how it's produced. And so you see that parallel even today.
That's fascinating. And do you expect more of that? I mean, where do you see the future? Is that basically it? We need to, if we're going, we as a society are going to have to make a decision.
Yep. Well, I think the other point, though, so that is a concern about all sorts of industrial production and commodities. The other thing, of course, is the environmental impact. I mean, all the evidence suggests that society needs to reduce its meat consumption dramatically. And that has to happen over time. But in the short term, we have to think about the impacts of that. And so the worst cases in terms of climate change is deforestation in Latin America. And while American beef production is kind of not directly coming from that, there are potential trade deals that are happening between the United States and Brazil that could put some of that meat on the American table. There's a whole conversation about beef and climate change that I think we have to be thinking about now that my characters weren't thinking about in 1880.
Well, the book is Red Meat Republic, a hoof-to-table history of how beef changed America. Joshua Specht, we will put a link to your book on majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.